So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bible, we'll be starting in chapter 1.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith, which means beginning or birth. And this book is attributed to have been written by Moses. That, along with the other 4 books, which make 5 books of the beginning, which is called the Pentateuch, which Pentateuch means 5, because he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And we can read about Moses in the book of Acts in 7:22, and we're told that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians because he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But this book of Genesis, this is not Egyptian theology. The Egyptians, they had many gods, they had many myths of creations, along with all the other cultures of the world. They all had their own myths. And there may have been something that Moses had written from the records in Egypt, but this is not Egyptian theology. And this also isn't the theology that was passed down to Abraham from the land of Ur, where he came from, because Abraham's family, they were a bunch of idolaters, and all their gods were limited gods. And Abraham was called away from that world to follow the only true God. But there had to be some kind of records passed down to Moses because he compiled such an excellent work. So it also had to have been revealed to Moses by God himself, because when we get to Exodus, we see Moses and he sits with God every day face to face, and they talk. And if you look at the timeline of the Bible and you look at the timeline of Moses, it hasn't been that far from creation, because Noah, his grandfather, Methuselah, he could have easily sat on the lap of Adam, because Adam didn't die till after Methuselah was born. And then even after the flood, because that was just a couple generations after that, that Shem, the son of Noah, he was still alive when Abraham was born. You see that this period was not too far from the beginning in Genesis. And this time was very, very close to the creation. And even though that man had gone through very many changes by this time, where many people have drifted away and they went into all different kinds of idolatry from the beginning. And when you read the story in Genesis, we're not given any information about God, but very little is revealed about God, because God, he doesn't have an origin like we have. And there's not much record of what he did before creation, because he's eternal. So God, he existed before his creation, and he also exists above his creation. God, he's not part of his creation. God is separate from his creation. Now, pantheism is the belief that God is a part of everything and that everything is a part of God. And I don't know if you guys know Shirley MacLaine, but she made a big whoop, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years. I don't know. I don't know how long it is anymore, but she said, I am God. I am God. Because that's the belief where everybody's part of God and God is part of everybody. And the trees are God and the ocean's God and God is in all of us. But we're not pantheists. We're Christians. And we believe that God is the creator of all things and that God is separate from his creation. And there's only one creator. And so there's a one creator, and then everything else is what he created. So we begin here, and it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the Hebrew word for created here is bara. And bara means created from nothing. It means there was no manipulation of any substance, that there wasn't hydrogen molecules that he had reformed or anything like that. It means there was no existing matter. There was nothing. That's what bara is. And bara is used 3 times in this first chapter of Genesis. And it's only God that can create from nothing. Only God can do bara. Now, there's another word in Hebrew for creating, which means to be created from substances that are already present. And that word is asa. And asa is used here 7 times. And it's usually translated made, or God made something, or even with man, he out of the dirt of the earth, he created him, but he made him out of substances that were already present. That's all man can do is asa. He can't do bara. It's uniquely God, because God, he is not dependent on the universe. Actually, it's the universe that's totally dependent on God. And that's because he has that kind of authority. And if you've ever noticed, the Bible never fights with us or tries to convince us that there is a God or the existence of God. And when this was written, there wasn't any debates if there was a God. Everybody believed in a God. And it was just, which one did you believe in? And God made it plain that he would be able to be seen in his creation. And in Romans 1:20, it says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes were clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead." And so God, he can be seen in his creation. But besides just being able to be seen, he also tells us that he's placed it into everyone's heart. So those people who do not see God in creation, or they don't see God, it's only because they don't want to see God. But the world did not create itself, and it did not come about by chance. This universe, it is not eternal. And the word that Moses uses for God, this creator of the world, throughout all the beginning of Genesis, is this Hebrew word called Elohim. And this word Elohim is used in Genesis 32 times. And Elohim is the plural form of the word El. El is the word God. Elohim technically means gods. But this word is always used here as if it was a singular word, not a plural word. And so it says gods, but it actually means God. And every time they use a verb with it or they use a pronoun with it, they're always singular. So their verbs have to match their nouns. It is saying God, and that's why they translate it God, but it actually means gods. And so what this is doing, God has given us a hint of the doctrine of Trinity from the very, very beginning here. That wasn't very clearly explained at all in the Old Testament. And we'll see more of this later when he gets to creating man, when he talks about let us create in our own image. So this Elohim, he's an intelligent designer. And I'm not a scientist, and I'm not going to pretend to be a scientist, and I'm not a great Christian apologist. I'm not going to pretend to be that. And so I'm not going to explain all these arguments, like the cosmological argument, where, everything that has a beginning has a cause. And then there's another argument, the teleological argument, that every design has a designer, but they are true. But there is a couple anthropic principles that I'd share with you. And anthropic principles, what they mean is principles of these things have to be around for sustaining of life on this planet. And one of them is about the gravity of the universe. The universe has exactly the right amount of gravity. If it had a larger gravitational force, it would get way too hot, and it would burn up quickly, and it wouldn't be able to support life. And if that force was any smaller, the stars would be too cool, because there would be no nuclear fusion, which means there would be absolutely no light or no heat. And even with our Earth, if our gravitational force was just a smidge different, we wouldn't have a sun. The sun couldn't exist. And there's a lot of books and there's a lot of movies by creation scientists, and they're good. Lee Strobel has a book. It's called A Case for the Creator. And then there's this movie called The Privileged Planet. They're great movies to explain all these things, and it's amazing. But Genesis, it wasn't written to be a scientific document. If it was written to be a scientific document, we wouldn't be able to understand it anyways. And in just the same way, Genesis was not written to be a historical document. Even though Jesus, he does quote from Genesis, and he quotes it like it is a historical record. And Genesis, it doesn't give us a detailed history of the world, but it does tell us our origins. And it tells us the origin of man, and it tells us also the origin of nations. What it does, what the Bible does, it'll take a line, it'll take a genealogy, and it'll only follow it so long, and then it'll drop it. It'll stop. Because the Bible is really only interested in one genealogy, and that's the line that leads to Jesus Christ. Because Genesis, along with the whole Bible, is written to achieve a purpose. And that purpose, it starts with creation, and then it reveals to us the fall of man, and then it tells us about those consequences from that fall of man. And then it tells us about the flood, the rebellion at Babel, but then it takes its focus and it focuses on Israel. It focuses on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, because that's where Jesus is going to come from, because he's going to come from Israel. Okay, so now we're going to start. Verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's great. Verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. All right, we got 2 verses, and now we have our first Christian controversy. It's called the gap theory. I don't know if you guys have heard the gap theory or you believe in it. What it is that some Christians believe that there's this large amount of time that's between verse 1 and verse 2. And it's like a really huge amount of time. And the reason they give it this amount of time is because they're trying to help explain the fossil record. And it's okay if you believe. There's a lot of good Christians that actually believe the gap theory, and that's fine. But I don't think that the Bible supports it. And the reason I don't think the Bible supports it, first of all, in my own mind, I don't think God created the world to go void where he spends the next 6 days trying to fix what he broke. I don't think so. But also, in Romans 5:12, it says that death came through Adam. And you have to realize that fossils, they're only around because they died. That was because of death. And nothing died before the fall of man. And another reason they have this gap theory, they'll say that Satan fell probably during that period. But in Job, it tells us that the angels, that they witnessed the creation of heaven and earth. But if you believe it, that's fine. And I understand that some people have a hard time with science and trying to make science fit into our view of God. But I don't really think we have to. The whole thing is just so impossible. It doesn't make sense without a God anyways. So now in the second part of verse 2, we see the Spirit of God, and he's hovering over the water. And what he's doing is he's taking organic material and he's changing it into life. And that's what the Holy Spirit always does. He takes things that are dead and he gives them life. The word for spirit here is ruah, which is the same word in Hebrew for wind. So spirit and wind, they're the same word. And then in verse 3, God says, "Let there be light." And if you read that in the Hebrew, it's much, much more dramatic, because what it says in Hebrew, it just says, "Light be," and light was. And it's instantaneous. It's like God just turned on the switch of the lights, and he just did it by his word. And then God named the light and the darkness, and he called it day and night. Okay, so that was our first day, and we have day and we have night, but you have to realize the sun, the moon, and the stars, they're not even created to the fourth day. So you have this light, but you don't have these things in our sky. And some people, they have a problem with that. But we shouldn't have a problem with that, because we see the same thing happen in Revelation, that when the sun and the moon and the stars all disappear, we still have light. And God is light. So we shouldn't have any problem with that. And then at the end it says, so the evening and the morning were the first day. The order of that is different than what we would think because it says evening and morning. But that's exactly like the Jewish day. The Jewish day always starts in the evening and is from evening to evening. And a lot of people will say, well, this couldn't be a literal day. You know, it's a time period. But the Hebrew word yom actually means just a literal day. I just stress this whole thing is impossible anyways. So to try to figure it out and to make sense, it's just better just to believe him, just to read it, because he's telling us stuff. He's not debating with us. He's telling us because he's telling us what happened. And if you can believe the very first sentence in the Bible, that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, if you can believe just that sentence, you should be able to believe anything. And you shouldn't have a problem with a 24-hour day. Okay, so we have our first day. We have day and night and light and dark. Now day 2, we have this firmament, okay. And this firmament is also in other translations called an expanse, or it's called space. And what they're talking about a water vapor that's suspended in the sky. And so this water vapor is being separated. It's being separated from the water that'll cover the planet and a water barrier that's going to be in the atmosphere. And it's believed at this time of creation, before there was ever any rain and before the flood, that instead of having clouds in the sky, that there was a blanket of water that surrounded the whole earth. And it kind of gave the earth a greenhouse. And the temperature was moderate. And so the vegetation would have grown very well. It'd be like the temperatures of Hawaii. And there is proof that it's possible that this is the way it was, because up in Siberia, you have all these woolly mammoths. And they're up in Siberia where it's been frozen forever, and at the top of Russia, by Russia there. And all these woolly mammoths, they were quick frozen. They were frozen in an instant. And they will go and they'll find these mammoths and they'll cut open their stomachs and they'll have tropical vegetation in their stomachs. And they knew they had to have been frozen so quickly. And they'll even take the meat and they'll cut off some of the meat and they'll fry it up and they'll feed it to their dogs. So that's one proof that it's very possible that there was this water blanket and that there was something that had dramatically happened and the whole world changed. Okay, so now that was the second day, the separation of the waters. Now on the third day, there was a lot that happened, and that's when the land appeared out of the water. And that's when all the different vegetation came, from the simple grass to all the fruit trees. And all those fruit trees were made mature. They were made mature, and they had fruit, and they had seeds in their fruit. And you have to remember, there's absolutely no sun yet, because the sun doesn't come to the fourth day. And there's another thing about them being created like this, is that with each seed that was created, there's DNA, and not only in every seed, but there's DNA in every cell. But you don't have to believe it, but I do. But there's something that actually kind of can prove that, is it's the fossil record, because the fossil record actually supports this view of creation. The fossil record supports that creation and life, that it just exploded, and it exploded at one time and not slowly, that life exploded, all the forms of life. So now after this third day, after the creation of all the plant life, we have the fourth day, and now we have the sun and the moon and the stars. And some people, they have a problem with that, but I don't. Because some people will say, well, the earth isn't the center of the universe. Well, I don't know if it's the center of the universe, but I would say it's the center of God's heart. Because I believe that all these things were created for a purpose, and this purpose is greater than the universe. The creation was something that was actually closer and more attached to God's heart than just making a bunch of stuff to have a lot of stuff. And, people will look, and they'll look in the universe and they'll say, well, we can't be the only ones here. There's so many stars, there's so many galaxies and planets. God must have created life somewhere else. And I'd agree with that. But I would say that would be like angels, and because there's all different types of angels, and he did create all those, but they're not of earth. They're from pre-creation. And one of the reasons I don't have a problem with this is because God, he has the infinite ability to create the world out of nothing, and to create a whole universe for just one planet, for the life of that world. Of course it's impossible, but everything's impossible if you take God out. And you look at it and it's like, he makes it out of nothing. It doesn't cost him anything. He could make universes and universes, each one for a planet, and he would never diminish any of his resources. But our planet, this earth, I believe it's the apple of his eye. And that's why we see his spirit hovering over it, because it's like a parent hovering over a child. And you don't have to believe this, but I do, because I do see God as our Heavenly Father. And I don't understand him really, really well, but I see him in his creation. And not only do I see him in his creation, I do sense his love in everything he has created. So the fourth day, God, he created the sun, and he created the moon and the stars. So what he's basically also tells us here is that he created his clock. This is God's clock. It's going to tell us when the Sabbath comes. It's going to tell us the annual feasts. It's going to tell us the seasons, where they begin and where they end. And then we go to the fifth day, and that's when God created all the birds and all the sea creatures. And it tells us that it was a great diversity. And this word for sea creatures here actually means the sea monsters. And it said God blessed them, and he told them to fill the earth and to multiply. And we don't see evolution here. That's because it couldn't have happened that way. Because evolution isn't that complex, but creation is way too complex. Because even in every living cell, there's over 200 machines that have to be working simultaneously just for the life to sustain itself, just for its survival. And it's the result from a creator. And Darwin, when he wrote his theory, he couldn't see that. When he wrote his book and he looked at a cell, all they saw was a blob. But now when we look into a cell, we can see all the parts and we can see all the movements. And we find that they all have to be together to be able to function, or else there could not be any life. And Darwin, his biggest opponents aren't Christians, and they're not theologians, and they're not pastors. In Darwin's day, his biggest opponents were the geologists, and they were the paleontologists, because they're the ones who claimed that the species didn't change, because they couldn't see it in the fossil records, because the fossils never changed. All right, so now the sixth day, that's when we get the land mammals. And it was just like the fish and just like the plants, God made them all according to their own kind. The cattle, the creepy things, the beasts. But then he does something totally different, and he creates man.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and Your Neighborhood Church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,